Well, I guess I was talking about going to town with Elvina and Grandma Kuss, and Grandma would usually end up buying me a new hat. You know, these straw hats that the kids would wear. You know, she always figured I should have one of them, and then quite often, you know, a little pair of bib overalls, and then maybe a shirt, and then usually maybe a candy bar or a bottle of pop, and so that was always a treat. And then Reinhold, when he would have to do some chasing, he would often take me along. He had I think it was 37 Chevrolet, maybe 36, but anyway, it was, at the time, it was pretty new, and so we would chase to town or over to one of the other farms or something. And one time, he took Uncle Lee along, I think, and Grandpa, and we went over to a farm, I think it was about 5 miles away, because they ended up buying a horse, and the horse was a nice looking horse, but the only problem was that Reinhold stayed, and we drove back, and Reinhold rode that horse back, and by the time he got back to the farm with the horse had blood coming out of his nose, and I don't remember what the story was, but the old man was, his old grandpa was pretty mad about it, because there was something wrong with that horse, and that's why the guy was selling it cheap, and so anyway, that horse was going back. I never did find out what the details was on that, other than was as far as I got with the story. One time we ended up, Reinhold and Elvina and Grandpa and Grandma and I rode back to Minneapolis in Reinhold's car, and we stopped at Rapidan. There was a dam. I suppose it was a Minnesota River, but anyway, there was a new dam built at Rapidan, and we had to drive out of the way. I don't remember how far. I think it was something like 8 miles, but that's the only time I ever got to see it, was when I went with Reinhold over there and see that dam. Well, you know, it's no big deal now to see the dam. It was a lot like going over here to Cross Lake and see the dam on a Snake River. But back then it was something special. And then we came on to the cities, and they visited with the folks for that day or so, and then I think they went on over to Uncle Bruno and Edith's place and visited with them, and so that was one of the events that took place somewhere in the year 39 or 40. That was after we had moved from 38th, or from it was 38th Avenue over to 38th and Polk. Getting back to the house on 38th Avenue, the one that's across the street from the Lonskys. They wanted to sell that house, and of course Ma didn't care all that much for it. It was a big old house that wasn't, not our style. But she found this little house over on Polk Street that was for sale, and she liked it real well. And I don't really know why, because it's just the character of it, I guess, that she liked. And so it was also pretty reasonably priced. I think the price was $350. So anyway, I believe she borrowed like $50 from Grandma, and she that was the down payment, and so she ended up. We bought paid down on the house, and then there was a problem moving in, because the Giles family that were living there was a guy by the name of Giles, and he had a wife, and she was supposed to have been some kind of a nurse. Well, anyway, they had I don't know for sure, but a whole mess of kids, like maybe 6 or 8 of them, and they were, well, you might say they almost lived in filth. Even though she was a nurse, they just, after we moved in, we found that the house was loaded with bed bugs, and the house was scroungy from one end to the other, and we had to. They had to have a court order or deal to get these people to move out, because they really didn't have any place to go either, but they couldn't pay the rent or anything, and so they had to go, and finally, I guess somebody found some place for them to move to, and so they got them out of there, and so we moved in, and the first thing that Ma did was open up the can of lye and heat up the water, and hot lye water, and she proceeded to scald the wall, the windowsills, the windows, the floors, and anything that had any possibility of any germs or anything, she went at with the lye water. She didn't know about the bed bugs right away. We found that out after we lived there a couple of days. The bed bugs were infesting behind the windows woodwork, and mopboards around behind the kickboards on the floor and so forth, and so it took a few days to figure out where all our bites were coming from that we thought at first were mosquito bites. But anyway, the bugs came out of the walls and they infested the beds. And so it was a case where we had to start fighting bed bugs, and a lot of people would fumigate. But when you fumigate, you got to move out for about 2 weeks, at least back then. And then they seal up the house and use cyanide fumigation to kill every germ in the place and every bug. But in our case, Ma figured out how to kill the bed bugs and their eggs, and that was with fire. The old man had a blowtorch, and so she would fire up that blowtorch, and around the windowsills, she would, send that fire up right along the edges, all around the windows, and then also bed springs. Take the bedding all off, and they would infest the bed springs with the coils. They would lay their eggs. Well, anyway, a little fire through those, and that exterminated them right now. But it still, with all the work, it still took us I don't know, probably 3 months of off and on going over everything to get them all. And but we did. I know I had to help her, and it was a case where I'd have always probably a milk bottle or something like that with water to kick out the fire if we started one. And so we burned out the bed bugs and finally got the house cleaned up, but the doggone house, $350 was no bargain. There wasn't a square corner or a level floor in the whole place. And we didn't know it, but the chimney was cracked too. And she had to start repairing. There was no end to fixing on that place, and everything we'd fix, something else would go haywire. But it wasn't. The one thing about it was fairly warm. It was the insulation qualities of the place it wasn't all that big anyway. But anyway, we could heat it fairly easily. So although we ended up with a nice fire, half burning the place down after a few years. Let's see, we went in there in 1938, and I think it was 42, something like about 42 or 43. We had a chimney fire. One of the bricks in the chimney was cracked, and when we had stoked up the fire good for like January, something like that, the fire shot out. I suppose there was some creosote. Yeah, as a matter of fact, that's what it was. There was the creosote in a tree, a green tree that a guy gave Pa. They claimed it was been around for a year, but it wasn't dry. It was a wet tree, and so anyway, we cut it up for firewood, and burning that doggone tree was bad news, because it give off enough creosote to coat the chimney, and then of course the chimney fire was what where it shot fire through the cracks sideways and got our upstairs the wall caught on fire, and of course it spread between the walls quite a bit, and ended up burning a lot of the house, so that took about 6 months of repair before we could get back in there, and so that was a real bummer for the fire. But getting back to the time we first moved in, it was 1938 in the summer, and that was the first bad year for me for summer fun, because I found out that was the year they quit selling fireworks. So that was the end of the 4th of July celebrations for me. But speaking of 4th of July celebrations, the year before, somehow I managed to get my hands on some little bit of fireworks, a package of firecrackers and a cap gun and some caps, and so anyway, we're down on the farm at Grandma's farm, and Marlon and Raymond are down there with me, and I remember now. That's how come I got it. I was down on the farm, and Grandma gave me the money for these caps and firecrackers, and so I picked them up in town when I was in there, and so here comes Marlon and Raymond and Ma, and we're all going to celebrate, and so Marlon and Raymond and I are having a big time with these firecrackers, and the only thing is, Raymond is a little kid, real little. He's like 2 years. Well, yeah, he's only a year and a half old, something like that. He's just big enough that he can't talk, but he can follow us around, and he keeps begging and begging and begging to throw one of them firecrackers. He sees how I would light one and throw them down, and they would go off, and so he just begging the hell out of me. So finally, I told him, I put one in his hand, and I showed him how, okay, here's your hand, I'm going to light it, and you're going to throw it. Well, yeah, great, that's what he's going to do. But I put it in his hand, and I light it, and instead of throwing it, he just swishes it back and forth next to his head, and when that thing went off, it about blew his eardrum all to hell. So he goes running for the house, screaming like heck, and Ma took all the rest of my fireworks away from me, and oh geez, that was a real bummer, and so that was really the last last year that I had a chance to play with fireworks, and then they outlawed them after that. But I got to tell you about one of the big deal things that had happened to me. That shortly after that session down there on the farm, I met old Mrs. Sutters, and Mrs. Sutters was a pen pal of Grandma Warner's, and they have been writing together for probably like 10 years or so, and so finally Mrs. Sutters, that was I think was from Illinois, and anyway, finally she was going to vacation and come and visit Grandma, and I don't remember for sure, but it was somewhere about 1940, and maybe 41. Anyhow, she came to visit, and I was there, and she took a liking to me, and asked me about different things and what I might like for my birthday. And I told her that, boy, I would really like one of those Red Ryder BB guns. That was what I really wanted. And so she said, well, I'll see what I can do. And I'll be darned if on my birthday she sent, I think it was about $7. You know that today that'd be like at least $100. And but anyway, she sent $7 for me to get that Red Ryder BB gun, and that's just what I did. And ironically, this month's Popular Science magazine that I'm getting has a big 2-page deal on the Red Ryder BB gun. It was the Daisy Company back in 1938, I think it was. The Daisy Company bought the rights to this BB gun from a guy that invented it, and they put out the Daisy rifle, and then they took on the Red Ryder label to help sell it, and it's become a real classic. The original, some of those guns BB guns are worth a real lot of money now. But back then, after I got it, I found that I couldn't afford BBs. And after I used up a few tubes of BBs, that'd be like 50 in a tube. And anyway, after I used them up, I couldn't afford BBs, so then I would just shoot it empty, which was a mistake, because the thing relied on a tubular pin to hit the BB, but also the air compression through the tube. Well, when there was no BB there for it to hit, it was just, like swinging a bat and not hitting anything, and it ended up snapping the tube off. And so it was a case where I wrecked my own gun because I didn't have BBs for it. And I did end up taking it apart, and I went down to one of the stores, the East Hennepin hardware store, and the guy ordered that tube part for me, and so that I don't remember, it cost a whole lot. It was something like 75 cents or something like that, but anyway, I ended up getting that tube for it and putting it back together again, but it wasn't meant to come apart and go back together, so it was never quite the same. But that was another event that happened, and that's one of the ways I learned how to shoot a rifle, though, is with that BB gun. And so it was the way I learned how to hunt. One of my early escapades when we moved on Polk Street there was building a chug. Back in those days, for lack of money, you couldn't buy anything in the line of toys very much, so yeah, a lot of times we'd make our own. And in this case, Cousin Chuck found that he showed up with some wheels, and he came up with 4 wheels and wanted. I don't know exactly how it came about, but somehow or other, anyway, we decided that him and I would build a chug. And a chug was like a go-kart, without an engine. And so we take these, you take the wheels, and if you had an axle, you put them underneath, put a board on it, and then on the front part of the board you put another axle with wheels, and you put a pivot the front axle so that you could steer it. And then if you put a rope from each side of that front axle, you pull the rope one way and steer that way, or pull it the other way and go the other way. And so then a lot of times with that board, which would probably be something like a 1-inch board, maybe whatever you could come up with, neat if you could find a board that would be like 12 inches wide, but most of the time the boards you come up with were like maybe 8 inches, 6, 8, or 10 inches, and so that you could sit on the board, and the board was the basic body. Well, then on top of that, you could take some kind of a wooden crate, peach box, or apple crate, something that you could nail on the front part of the board, like the hood of an engine, and run the ropes through it, and so on. And so anyway, Chuck and I, he had the wheels, and I come up with the boards and stuff to build the rest of it, and Ma helped. And so between Chuck and Ma and I, we built the chug. And so it's a case where I remember we got the thing going, and so the first night, Cousin Chuck said, well, he would take it home with him, and he would use it the first night, and then he'd bring it back for me the second. And so he used it the first night, and the second day he comes back down with it, and one of the things that I didn't consider, or nobody considered, was that when we pounded some of the nails in some of this wood, that they were sticking out a little bit on the inside. So anyway, my first trip on the chug was down the Polk Street Hill, and I made the mistake of trying to wheel into to the driveway a little too fast, and I tipped over, and when I tipped over, my legs come flying out of that hood box, and there was a nail there, and I scratched the heck out of one of my legs, and so you don't forget that very easy. Especially when you got this big scratch bleeding and Ma dumps rubbing alcohol on it. Well, I never had any infection problems. That alcohol does the job, and I learned how to put up with a little pain, and so to this day I still use the alcohol. It still hurts, but boy, it sure cures it fast. The year 1938 was when I started fourth grade at Silver Lake School, and so this was another get acquainted situation. Donnie Pachaki and Kenny Carlson. I guess the other guys were like Dick Sullivan and Charlie Sheridan and those, but my close friends were more like Carlson and Pachaki. Pachaki was not only about my age and my class and so on, but he was also about my size, and so we were both kind of small, so we were kind of paired off and doing things like the class play and stuff like that. Then Kenny Carlson, he is a year or so older than me, but he was in my class, and his sister, Mary Carlson, married cousin John Draper. So that gave Carlson a little bit of a tie-in with me, and we're still together, good friends. So then, anyway, we fourth grade, a new teacher, a young teacher, Miss Pranty, was teaching fourth grade that year, and she was. I liked her, and so contrary to third grade where I hated it, fourth grade I started to learn something again, and so I got back in the groove where at least I didn't flunk out, and then it was a very tough time. I couldn't remember the Christmas tree, for instance, that we had in fourth grade. If people that there were so many of us on welfare and WPA and so on that if you requested, you could have the Christmas tree after when we left for Christmas vacation, and so that was a deal where I know I think that particular year Pachaki got the tree, I think, and then that was also a year when this Miss Pranty had old Wiggins, the janitor, help us build a classroom playhouse, which was a large for kids' playhouses was kind of a big one, because it was made out of a 4x8 sheet of plywood, and I think he cut the plywood in half, so it was about a 4x4 playhouse, and then use the other half of the plywood to section off rooms in it and so forth. And of course, it was the girls mostly, but they had play furniture and babies and toy stuff of all kinds for it, and baby dolls. And then anyway, that was the year that I got acquainted with most of a lot of my longtime friends. And the next year, 5th grade, was Miss Mapes, and again, she was a hard-nosed teacher, and the only thing I could say that was a little snooty about her was that she once made the statement that skim milk was for pigs, and that cream is what you ate with your breakfast cereal. And it would be interesting to see what her opinion would be of that today. Anyway, she was a good teacher, though, and especially world geography and things like that, where she did world traveling, and so we learned a lot about world geography and the peoples and products around the world. And it was it was good for me, because it gave me an interest in the world instead of just the town you live in. One of the things in 1939, I think it was, the WPA started a sewer and water project up and down the streets and sidewalks and gutters and so forth. And so it turns out that one of the sewer lines ran, or well, maybe it was water, I'm not sure, but anyway, they hand dug these lines like 6 feet underground. They went down about 6 feet, and they dig a square hole, a rectangular hole. They go down by hand and shovel down 6 feet, then by about 2 feet wide and about 4 feet long holes all down the street, and then down on the bottom of the holes they would connect to the next hole. They were usually about 2 feet apart, so that you go down one hole and then you dig endwise to the next hole 2 feet over, and so they end up making what I think was sewer and water lines going through. I know that it went all the way up to Silver Lake School, and as a matter of fact, I think it went all the way from 37th Avenue I think they piped in somewhere around 37th Avenue and went all the way up those streets. All over Columbia Heights, they would were digging these sewer and water deals, whatever, and they put in sidewalk too in many cases. And to this day, you can go down around Columbia Heights and see the sidewalks with WPA 1938, WPA 1939, and 40 and 41. I think there might have gone into 42, but basically I think 41 was probably the last year that the WPA was involved. And anyway, that concrete and those jobs, they were always knocking the WPA but that's some of the best products that the country has ever had, and a lot of it's still there. Well, I could take you around some of the streets where some of the sidewalk was put in after we were married in the 50s, and 10 years later is crumbling, cracking up or whatever. I think they just some of these private outfits were chinched on the amount of concrete they used on some of these sidewalks, and it looked, by the looks of the cracks in that, they would end up only being an inch thick, where it's supposed to have been 3 inches or 4. And so anyway, that's one of the things that took place years ago. I was pretty lucky in a lot of ways getting through that depression on the end when Darlene and Mary, neither one of them were inclined to be studious, so they both had trouble in school. Neither one of them had much interest in it either, for that matter, but they both, times were tough, and so the first chance they got, they went to work. They were early years when they were small, babysitting and doing housework, washing dishes and cleaning houses, and they both worked every chance they got to make a nickel, a dime, or a quarter, and so anyway, when they worked in the restaurants and different places, they always shared their money with me. When it come time for my birthday or Christmas, I would get something, usually quite often because of them, and so like they had saved up early days, and somewhere around probably 1940, they bought new bicycles, and so that meant that they shared the bikes with me. I didn't have a bike, but they let me I'd borrow their bikes, and so it turns out that Mary's bike she ended up giving it to me, and so of course I wasn't too smart. I thought I could doll that bike up so that it'd look fancy, and that was not a good idea, because everybody would say, well, you got to take off the old paint, and you repaint them, and you do this, that, and the other thing. Well, take off old paint. Well, you got to torch that off. So I went at it with the blowtorch, take the old paint off that bike, and talk about stupid. If I would have just taken a little bit of, well, if I'd left it alone, it wasn't all that bad in the first place. It was just chipped up a little here and there, But then if I would have taken some smooth sandpaper or, emery cloth or something like that, to take off some of the rough edges and then repainted it. But they didn't have those cans of spray paint in those days, So Cousin Dorothy's husband worked in a casket factory down in Northeast, and they did a lot of paint spraying. And he told me if I wanted he would paint the bike for me. And so that's another way I got involved. I had to get it ready for him, and so that's one of the things that happened during the course of my bicycle ownership. I got it repainted, and so yeah. But it never comes out like new. So it was a good bike, and I used the heck out of it. I went everywhere on that bike, and so when I got my paper out, I peddled papers with that bike. I put a basket in the front, and carried a lot of newspapers. I had 136 customers. But anyway, that bike was my transportation, and I learned how to. I got so good with it that I went up to Osborne's grocery store one day, and Ma had ordered a peck of potatoes along with a whole bunch of other groceries, and so I had so many that I had, and at that time I didn't have. That was one of the days when I didn't have the basket on yet for the newspapers. I just had the bike, and so I had 2 arms full of groceries, and that I started off on his. He had a little step steel there, and I started off and I rode that bike no-handed down and around the corner, down the hill, up the driveway, and all the way to close to the door of the house before I just stepped off the bike and let it drop. And that was something that I never heard of anybody else being able to do that, and I'm sure they can, but anyway, it was one of my feats, so I was proficient with the bicycle anyway. You ever hear this story, if it ain't broke, don't fix it? Now, somebody should have told me that when I was a kid, because when Mary still had the bike and she had it down on Grandma's farm, I had heard that, all the guys were taking their wheel bearings apart and cleaning them and greasing them and so forth. So anyway, I thought that's what she needed too.